We've been lucky enough today to catch up with Chris Packham, whose book Fingers in the Sparkle Jar has been voted the nation's favourite nature book, following the AHRC poll in association with the Landlines Project. So Chris, my first question is just, what's your response to this accolade?
Enormous surprise, of course, given the other 9 books which were in the final 10 nominees. I didn't expect to win at all, not when you're up against Wind in the Willows and Tarka the Otter, which were very formative books in my life and that in many others. So flattered as well, of course, and the pleasure stems from the fact that when the book was published, the vast majority of interest and discussion that it promoted was about my Asperger's. And not the nature writing, and yet when I wrote it, writing about the Asperger's is easy for me. It's not hard. We that's what we do, us, autists. We're quite frank and plain speaking. But the nature writing, I wanted to really work hard on. In fact, before I wrote the book, I reread some of my favourite nature books so that I could ensure that I would be doing something different. I didn't want to replicate any of that, and also to look at the standard, and the standard is obviously very high. So I did toil over all of my analogies and similes and metaphors and everything else, and and I tried to infuse it with as much poetry as possible. And I certainly spent an enormous more time on that than anything else. So to finally see the nature writing sort of recognised was heartening, actually.
And you mentioned the 10 in the list, and it's quite it's a really great list. It's really diverse. There's some real classics in there. Beyond that list, what nature writing has inspired you over the years and helped in your development as a naturalist?
Well, an enormous list of books, obviously. Let's strip out the textbooks first of all, because people like myself like acquiring knowledge. So as a child, I was always in the text section of the library, and I would go every Saturday with my father and withdraw as many books as I was allowed and consume them normally within a couple of days, and then want to go back again. And so it was down to my mother to introduce me to literature and particularly poetry. She was very fond of that. So she would read to me. She read My Side of the Mountain, which was an American book about a young boy who runs off to the Catskills and coincidentally, takes a peregrine falcon, which he keeps as a companion. The first book that I read for myself was Ring of Bright Water. I found it in a book sale that she took me to one afternoon. Obviously I was drawn by the cover with a picture of the otter and then the photographs of the otters within. And then she said to me, well, if I buy you that book, you're going to read it yourself. And it was her way of obviously instigating that, inaugural process. So I did. I toiled over it. It wasn't an easy read, actually, for a sort of a 5 or 6 year old, to be honest with you. But I got an enormous amount of joy from it, and I felt a great affinity for this man who'd found his place in this wilderness and had this incredibly close bond with his otter. And then obviously I sort of caught up on all of the other sort of classics that you might imagine, so the Gerald Dole books, of course. As an adult, well then, I got into the academic side, and there was very little time for literature, if I'm honest with you. It was more scientific papers, desperately dry, and not infused with a great deal of poetry. And then immediately I graduated, I recognised that there was an enormous hole in my, sort of artistic life, and I started to read all sorts of books that I should have read before, including quite a few nature books. So Peter Matheson's series, Lost Man's River, Killing Mr. Watson, set in Florida, beautiful writing. Then I met Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, which I still consider to be, my favourite nature book of all. It's so prescient, and it was written in the 20s and the 30s, and so much of the stuff that he wrote there, I feel now, and people have felt ever since. And had we acted on his thoughts about conservation and protecting the environment and connecting with the environment, the world would be a very much better place now. So it's quite a sad read, but there's one section in it, Escudillo, where he writes a story about a grizzly bear, which unfortunately is slain. I can barely read it without tears. It's beautifully written. To me, that's what I aim for, is something like that, and it's timeless. It's extraordinary and infused with an enormous range of emotions and things to get you thinking about.